Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome back for the third and final day of Swell. Thank you so much for being here. Hopefully some of you have had the chance to be with us over the last couple of days, and I hope some of you joined us last night with the Steve Miller Band. It was a fantastic evening. Hope you enjoyed it. This is the final keynote, and if you've seen the first two keynotes, you know we've had just some world-class speakers coming in here, Dr. Ben Bernanke, Tim Berners-Lee, and we're very fortunate to have another prominent thinker around the blockchain space join us today, Don Tapscott. Don is the CEO of the Tapscott Group. It's one of the leading authorities on the impact of technology in business and society. He's authored well over a dozen books. The latest book is one he authored with his son, Alex Tapscott, who's a CEO and Bitcoin investment banker. The book's titled Blockchain Revolution, How Technology Underlying Bitcoin is Changing Business, Money, and the World. In 2015, Don became a member of the Order of Canada and was ranked the fourth most influential management thinker in the world by Thinkers 50. Interestingly, in 2008, right after the financial crisis, Don gave the closing keynote at Sibos. And it's sort of poetic that now, here 9 years later, he's coming to give the closing keynote here at Swell. So with that, please join me in a round of applause and welcome Don Tapscott.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank and congratulate Ripple for doing this, because I think that Swell has actually more than enhanced the Sibos. It's helped move the ball forward overall. And sometimes you have to be a little bit outside the tent to get the people in the tent to start to pay attention to an important development. And so I agreed to do this talk enthusiastically. So there's some big changes that are happening, obviously, with technology, banking, and the world. And I'd like to just start with a little historical view on how I came across this. Some of you may remember in 1994, I wrote the book, The Digital Economy, which they say was the first bestseller about the web. And 20 years later, my publisher asked me to do an anniversary edition. And I had to reflect on what's happened in the last 20 years and where we're going from here. And I started wondering, well, what are going to be the big technologies? Naturally, I gravitated to AI and machine learning. And, but the more I started exploring Bitcoin, I started figuring out that maybe the underlying technology, blockchain, that enables a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin to work could be the real pony here and the real thing that's transformational. And meanwhile, my son Alex was an investment banker, and he was getting all this Bitcoin and increasingly blockchain deal flow about 4 or 5 years ago. And the two of us, over a very nice bottle of wine and a very nice steak on a father-son ski trip 4 years ago, decided that we would work together on this. So, and that's led to a really joyous collaboration for me, and I'll tell you some of the fruits of that later. So, if you talk to the people up the street about fintech, you'll hear a lot about these technologies. AI, machine learning technologies that do things that they weren't programmed to do because they're capable of evolving. Robo-advisors, virtual reality, and so on. But to me, the most important technology and the foundation for all of these, insofar as they're going to play in the corporation, in the financial industry, and in the economy, is blockchain. And to me, this is nothing less than the second era of the internet. Now, lots of people talking about this over the last, that I don't think this is some new interesting technology. This is 1994. Again, thank you for that punctuation point. And an internet of information for decades. I'm dating myself. I started on this in the 70s. And I wrote a book in 1981 arguing for the internet. And my mom did most of the copies of that book. It was like a study. But the Internet of Information was great, but a little known detail about that is that when I send you some information, email, a PDF, a PowerPoint, whatever, I'm actually sending you a copy, not the information. Even with a website, I keep the original. And that's great for information, but when it comes to things that really matter to the financial system and to our economy, assets, things of value, money, stocks, bonds, intellectual property, our identities, art, music, votes, assets, sending a copy is a terrible idea. You don't want someone copying your identity or your votes, and if I send you $100, it's really important that I don't still have the money and that I can't send it to somebody else. So as you know, cryptographers have called this a double spend problem, and the way that we solve this problem in society is through large intermediaries. Well, these intermediaries increasingly need a lot of help. So I think that what this stuff represents is a second era of the internet. It's not another layer on the stack. We've had an internet of information, and now we're getting an internet of value, where anything of value ultimately, from money to art, can be stored, transacted, secured in a confidential way. This is a native digital medium for value, and this is a big deal. So it's 1994. Imagine if in 1994 you knew then what you know now about the Internet of Information. Well, we can extrapolate a lot, and that's what I'm going to try and share with you today. Take you out about 20 years and talk about what this is going to do. By the way, those of you who don't have a blockchain revolution, the best way to get it is in massive volume, okay? Christmas is coming soon. I know for a fact some of you have. Seriously, I'm very a book about this topic. Whirlwind tour. I was asked to give a state of the world about this whole blockchain. So I'm going to talk about the impact of 3 major institutions, some of the challenges to be done going forward. Financial services. It was 2 days after Lehman Brothers did the closing keynote at Cyber, and I did discard my PowerPoint the night before, which in general is a good thing, because, you know, power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts, absolutely. But, and I talked about what I thought was wrong with the financial industry. And I said, look, you're going to remember the world up to this day, and you're going to remember the world after this day. This is a punctuation point in human history. And the core modus operandi of this industry almost brought down the global capitalist system, and it may still happen. If it doesn't get bailed out by the US federal government and other players, then we're going to go into a massive crisis. You know, I didn't know, but at that time, we were days, some people say hours away, from the banks or the ATMs running out of cash. So these intermediaries overall have done a pretty good job, but starting 2008, we started to wonder a bit. And there are growing problems, and I'm not suggesting they need to be eliminated, but although some of them will be, but they need help. They're centralized, and anything that's centralized can be hacked, and JP Morgan and Home Depot and even the CIA found that out the hard way. They slow things down. It takes a second for an email to go around the world. It can take days or even weeks for money in computers, or not money, but digital assets in computers to move up the street on Wall Street. They charge the system. It can cost 10 to 20% to send money from one country to another. Has anyone ever heard of cross-border email payments? You know, it's kind of ought to be the same thing, shouldn't it? It's all about bits. They exclude a couple of billion people from the global economy. Now, in fairness to the banks, it's not just that they don't have enough money to be profitable. These people, many of them, don't have an identity. And overall, we have this strange situation where data is the new oil. It's a new asset class, probably as important as previous asset classes, land, industrial plant. We create this data, but large intermediaries, not just banks, but social media companies, search engines, and other institutions capture it. And so we have this crazy situation where our economies are growing and the middle class is shrinking. The benefits of the digital age, and it's tough for me to admit, because I've been a big champion of technology for 35 years now, the benefits of the digital age have been distributed asymmetrically. So, what if we had an internet of value? How could that change the financial system overall? Does anyone know what this machine is? Thank you. Who said that? Okay. Goldberg machine. An American inventor developed all these ridiculous. We'll talk about nostril. It's like a credit card. You tap and there's a bunch of messages go through half a dozen companies, some of them using 30-year-old technology, each with a counterparty risk and each taking cost or adding cost to the system, and 3 days later a payment and a settlement occurred. Maybe there's a better way. Maybe if we had some kind of distributed ledger, the payment and the settlement would be the same activity. There would be no 3-day clearing and settlement period. There would be a 0-day, 0-minute payment and settlement period. There would be no counterparty risk. And that was the problem in 2008, right? All these counterparties in trouble. There would be no counterparty costs. The metabolism of the banking system would be sped up. So Payments Canada has done some pretty interesting work. Is anyone here from a Canadian bank? Okay, great. And I actually gave the opening talk to the Payments Canada Summit this year. And this is their vision of what a new payments system could mean for Canada. And of course, it's going to link out globally to the world. And I said, that's pretty awesome, and I support that. But what if you added a distributed ledger to it? Could you have micropayments? You're going to need that, ultimately, because when that light bulb buys some power from a distributed power source, it's not going to go through the traditional Visa network, for example. It's the Internet of Things is going to need a ledger of things for that to occur. Or when I listen to Imogen Heap's new song, which is posted on a blockchain, and she charges me a few microcents, we're going to need a platform to be able to do that. We're going to need peer-to-peer payments, increasingly. We're going to need real-time tracking and auditing. We're going to need anonymous payments. Privacy is an important thing. People say to me, come on, Don, privacy's dead. Get over it. I think this is stupidity. Privacy is the foundation of freedom, and we need to protect it. And we'll get more to that later on. We need embedded payments in all kinds of new vehicles, like smart contracts. We need better security. The way I like to think about a blockchain as something highly processed and just sort of like a chicken McNugget, you know? And to hack it would be like turning the chicken McNugget back into a chicken. Now, someday somebody's going to be able to do that, but for now, that's going to be tough. So these technologies are going to be infinitely more secure than the kind of systems that you people have in the Canadian banks. How about a single version of the truth? Where's my brother Bob is here somewhere. Oh, there he is, Bob Tapscott. He was the CIO at Citibank, and he used to talk about dueling spreadsheets. People would come in with multiple versions of the truth, and you'd have to decide which was the right version of the truth. Wouldn't that be cool? Because we're all looking at the same ledger. And, of course, instant settlements. So Payments Canada has not yet decided to move to a blockchain, and they've got lots of legitimate timing and other reasons. But I believe that they will do it ultimately, and this will be a sensible thing to do. Now, there's a lot more to this than payments, although we'll talk about that in a sec. In the book, we had to think about, well, what is it, all the things that the financial industry does? And actually, this is Alex's work. It does 8 things. It authenticates and attests to value, so you are who you are. This is a real dollar. It transfers value, money, stocks, whatever. It stores value. It used to be in safes, and now it's in computer systems, mainly. Because it stores value, it gets to lend value. It gets to exchange value, like markets, stock markets, and so on. Fund and invest value, so you've got venture, hedge funds, mutual funds, and so on. Insure value and manage risk, and overall to account for and audit value. Now, in theory, every one of these can be eliminated by distributed ledger technology. That will not occur, of course, because the incumbents are working hard to figure out how to embrace this technology. But you take any one of these, and we're in for a period of some pretty big changes. And it means that companies in the financial industry need to think strategically. They need to get beyond thinking about how can we displace and avoid costs, to think about how can we use this technology to create new businesses, new markets, new customers, new value. And I'll just give you an example of that. We did the book launch and was hosted by NASDAQ in New York City. And it went on for a couple of hours. There was someone there from Ripple, actually, on a panel. And in the conversation, I think stock markets will appear. So at the end of the morning, this gets up and he says, you're probably wondering why we're enthusiastic about this particular technology company. We know how to, and we have a dozen projects underway that are looking at using blockchain to create customers. And on the stage, real demonstration of a net delivered electrical power grid where sun on a panel, solar panel, power is generated, sold into a market in the neighborhood, and we watch some crypto came onto the computer. So that's an example of a company in the industry that's thinking strategically, not just about talk about each of those. I'd like to just talk about ICOs for a sec, because this is one of the things that's by this technology. In the book, we think venture capital will be unrecognizable in in 5 years. We're wrong. Venture capital is unrecognizable. As of this year, more money's been raised in ICOs, early stage companies, than all venture capital. So, and some of them, they did 250 million in investment banking and the rise of collaborative finance that will enable companies somewhere, I don't know, in the middle, but it's neither of those. So I think that this is a legitimate offering. This is from yesterday's newspaper. It's a non-equity process for raising capital. Custom cryptocurrency and the block coins. This is also reflective of the fact that the hype cycle is cranked up pretty strong. What should governments do with ICOs? Well, in China, they're in the process of banning them, at least temporarily. We'll see when President Xi is reelected in a couple of weeks, what new kind of regime will be brought in around this, and some people are anticipating a lot of change. But the SEC and, for example, the OSC in Ontario are pretty much taking a sensible approach. So they say, well, if it's a token that represents a security, then it's a security. It's not that hard. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And it's going to come under securities legislation, or else by all means do it, but you can't have our citizens invest in it. If the token is clearly not a security, so it's a currency, it's a utility token representing a carbon credit, or something else, then that falls outside of securities legislation. And if it's in a gray area, come and talk to us. So far, so good on this stuff. Now, there are other areas where the authorities are not so great, and we'll talk about that later. But there's a lot going on today. And overall, I view that as a positive thing. Another big thing that's happening, of course, that will affect the banks is that we've had double entry accounting for 370 years. And it's actually the foundation of the corporation and of capitalism. Well, when The Economist did a cover story on blockchain, they were more hyperbolic than me. They didn't compare it to the first era of the internet. They compared it to the creation of double entry accounting. And so this is an example of a Bitcoin transaction. You get a debit, you get a credit, but automatically there's an entry made onto the ledger. So that means there's real-time accounting. So smart companies, we're working with KPMG and Deloitte, understand that this is going to affect their audit business big time. And it creates an opportunity for them to create a next generation real-time audit, as opposed to someone coming in at the end of the year and sampling activities. Now another, full disclosure, this is my son, now that I'm talking about, in case you didn't notice. But so he's creating another new generation financial company. This will be the first publicly traded company investing in a basket of early stage blockchain companies and digital assets. And fully regulated, he chose the Toronto Stock Exchange, the 5th largest in the world, rather than he could have done this on others, but he chose that. And the TSX is a great organization that amazingly gets it. And he raised $20 million, and he's doing an IPO that starts on Monday, where he will raise, who knows, it says a $50 million. I'm sure it will be far oversubscribed. But you'll be able to just phone up your broker and say, I want to buy some of that. So that's going to be pretty cool. So let's talk about payments here for a second. I can see I'm still on point number 1. I'm going to have to pick up the pace here. So, and how about international payments? Well, I mean, selling an apple between two peers is pretty straightforward. Doing it across the ocean is more complicated. And the way that we used to handle this is by a single company owning everything, the East India Trading Company, for example. And trust was syndicated within the company because you didn't have to trust external parties, because trust, which is the expectation that the other party will act with integrity, right? That they'll be honest, considerate of your interests, and abide by their commitments. Trust is the expectation that the other party will do the right thing. Well, you could do that within a company, but as companies began to unbundle, then trust needed to be syndicated across a broader community. So for a lot of the international transactions and messages, we have SWIFT doing that. Why is that? Well, these are the kinds of things, I'm not going to go through it all, but that we've identified that why SWIFT exists. And why, and historically, for a single transaction of, say, $3,000, they can charge $211 for that transaction to occur. Well, that's the way it was. Is there a better way now? Well, trust doesn't need to be achieved by a big central intermediary. It can be achieved by some cryptography, by some mathematics, by some mass collaboration, and by some clever code working together. And this is going to inevitably create a more secure, faster metabolism, lower cost, and higher value platform for these global messages and global payments to be conducted. And you know about Ripple. Example of a company that's leading in the case of Ripple. There are others, but Ripple's the leading player, and by the way, I always say the same thing in the sense that I say the truth regardless of who my host is. I found that's just much more practical, especially in the days of the internet, and because someone can catch you up if you present false information, as famous politicians are learning today in the world. So when they tweet, and they tweet things which are different from what they said before. So, but this is a really exciting opportunity. I'm very optimistic about Ripple, and I think that, again, this is not some cool new technology. It's something that's transformational. So, and as for SWIFT, I think seeing as we're in the other conference, 2 of the 3 Swiss core value propositions are in peril. Share registration authority for ISO 20022, and that can't continue. But the other 2, creating a secured network and secured messages, are in jeopardy. And to me, this is a time of big change, and the jury's out if SWIFT is going to step up. And it's a victim, in some ways, of leaders of old paradigms have great difficulty embracing the new. Okay, 1 of 7 down. We're really going to pick this up now. Number 2, what does this mean for the and the corporation? Well, this up, and I'm told this for a long time. It's a Toronto story. And the reason I know this story, this guy, Rob McEwen, is my neighbor. To say, I scour the world for the best. No, he moved to me, and he held a cocktail. Some of your books, and I said, "Great, what do you do?" Now I'm a gold miner. He's a funny guy. He introduced his wife to the group, and he's my wife. She's a gold digger, and thankfully she is not. A brilliant entrepreneur with a sense of humor. And he tells me this amazing story of tell him where the gold is. So he to get more geological data. He does this again and again. Over several years, he's epiphany. He wonders, if my geologists don't know where the gold is, maybe somebody else does. So he does the thing. He takes his geological data, and he holds a contest called the Gold Corp. It's basically $500,000 in prize money. Do you have any gold? And if so, where is it? He gets submissions from all around the world. They use techniques. $1 billion worth of gold, which he million today. And I can tell you, my neighbor, he's a happy camper. Now, He viewed the firm with the Internet of Information. Rob is now in the early days of a profound changes to the deep structure paper, where he asked a deceptively simple question. He said, why does the firm exist? That for allocating goods and resources, people, assets, information. Why isn't everybody an independent contractor? Why do we all work in firms? And he said the answer is, and he won a Nobel Prize for saying this, he talked about these 4 classes of cost. Search of finding all the boundaries. You have processes and org structures, and the cost of establishing trust. Age Corporation did everything from soup to porous. We used to call it the extended enterprise. And then we saw the rise of the platforms emerging for distributed value creation. Big changes, and you can see it already. So I'll just give you one example. We defined this thing, we called it a distributed company with no CEO, no management, no people, and hallucination. A book came out, an organization was launched called the Distributed No Management, No People. Its goal was to invest in dollars. Now, it's not a happy ending, because who knows the story? Anybody? Yeah, a few of you. There was a flaw in one of the smart contracts, and a hacker got in there. And now he said, I'm not a hacker. I'm just abiding by. This was done on Ethereum, and the Dylan, you know, there's something going on here, and you don't know what it is. $164 million. Extraordinary. So these are 7 of dozens of new business models that we talk about in our research and in the book. I think big data is toast, basically, at least the way that we think of it. Companies like Uber and Airbnb can be replaced by distributed software and a blockchain. Will they? Who knows? But they could, because blockchains do all the things that they do. Identity, contracting, payments, and reputation. Blockchains are ideal for this kind of thing. And the important supply chains in the world are moving towards this platform as well. Foxconn, biggest blockchain in the world, we've been studying them, or biggest, supply chain in the world. And we think that supply chains are being imbued with knowledge. They're becoming cognitive, and we've renamed them asset chains. And we think that this is a whole new breakthrough in how to think about the way that we orchestrate capability. Tied in with this, the notion of identity is changing as well. The virtual you, your identity, the mirror image of you that contains all this data, health, education, transactional, government, and so on, is not owned by you. It's owned by big social media companies and others. So we need to get our identities back so that we can manage them responsibly, use this data to plan our lives, we can monetize it, and we can also protect our privacy. So there are projects underway to create a portable identity on a black box, on a blockchain. I know that's kind of weird. I don't know where they got. I'm trying to figure it out. Is that actually my body? I don't think so. Anyway, anyway, so this is one. Microsoft, for example, is working to build something like that. Okay, what about government? This is our final state of the nation in terms of how it's going. Well, 3 big classes of change. You know, the idea of reinventing government was in a book by Osborne and Gabler in 1993. And Al Gore, a year later, came out with the Reinventing Government report. Better, cheaper government. The internet was going to enable us to reinvent government. Is there anyone here who thinks governments have been reinvented, fundamentally changed? I think we paved the cow path, didn't we? We took existing business processes and structures and we kind of automated them. Well, now we have an opportunity to bring about some very profound change, using these platforms to speed up transactional activity, to cut out middlemen players. And imagine each of us having our own rich identity that's portable across all kinds of government agencies. This is the holy grail, because we're organized into these silos, organizational silos, that each now have information technology that looks like the old organization. And the only way that we can fix that is to center government on citizens with our own identity. So there's some really exciting stuff that's going on. It's not a theory. Thomas Elves, this guy, until recently, the president of Estonia. I talked to him first time 4 years ago. You have a head of state who knows what a blockchain is, and says, yeah, we're building all of our citizen identity on a blockchain. Then we have some really interesting opportunities like CarbonX. This is one that I'm personally involved in, and this is creating a personal carbon trading system for individuals. Not just, you know, if a company can benefit from being green, why shouldn't an individual? And this is part of a general plan to change human behavior. We need to mobilize the world to solve this problem. The world's been mobilized before, but it was around world wars, where we're on different sides. We need to be on the same side. We need every government at every level, every company, every NGO, every kid in every schoolyard behaving differently. And CarbonX, we hope, will be the tool to do that. Then you've got governments like Dubai that are saying, and that's a government service, CarbonX, not delivered by a government. Okay, so this is a new division of labor in society about how we create public value. Dubai wants to be the first all blockchain government. We'll see if they pull that off.
What's up on your screen here?
I'm sorry. That's not supposed to be actually a video. But how about, you know, a lot of government people, the first thing you talk to them, they say, well, Bitcoin, yeah, that's for criminals, right? Or all this blockchain stuff, that's just to commit crime. Well, they have a point. I mean, criminals always adopt new technology most effectively before anybody else, the automobile, the flip phone, whatever. But now, really smart law enforcement agencies, like Katie Haun, who's a chief federal prosecutor in the US, talk about how they're using blockchain to catch the bad guys. And the financial industry should think about it and love this, because this is a lot better than cash. Cash is the foundation of organized crime. It's the foundation of the drug industry. It's the basis for a lot of evaporation and spillage and corruption. And with blockchain, of course, transactions can be anonymous, but there's metadata that enables law enforcement agencies to understand if there's something weird that's going on. Watch this TED Talk by Katie Haun. It's fantastic. And she'll tell you how they're using blockchain to catch the bad guys. We're just trying to go forward here. Okay. So the next one is democracy itself, not just government, but governance. And there's a lot of really exciting stuff that's happening here. And thank goodness, because we have a crisis emerging. Trust is dropping in our democratic institutions. And at a certain point, that becomes a crisis of legitimacy. Legitimacy meaning you may disagree with who's in power, but at least you think the system is the best system. Well, more and more young people, youth voting's been declining for 15 years in most OECD countries, and many young people in the US, the last federal election, said they didn't vote. They agreed with the bumper sticker, don't vote, it only encourages them. I think that's a problem, because the alternatives to democracy aren't that great, from my perspective. Could we move to a second era of democracy? The first, we created these representative institutions, but there was a weak public mandate. Citizens were inert. Politicians were beholden to powerful interests, and nobody really knew what was going on because it was all done in opacity. Could we have a second era where we have citizens, for example, voting not just for politicians, but tied into smart contracts where politicians are beholden to the electorate, not to big money, where we have an environment of transparency and a culture of public deliberation and active citizenship. This could be very exciting. All kinds of ways that can occur. I don't have time to talk about them. You can read it in the book. But e-voting's a big one. Nobody's ever going to vote on a computer unless you have cryptographic proof that your vote was cast for the person for whom you voted, and it can't be double counted, right? The double spend problem. You need to know that. So the billions of dollars spent on e-voting has largely been wasted. We can now move to an e-voting environment. The final one is reinventing the central banks. So, and this is really exciting. The IMF met last week. There's a lot of discussion. There's central bankers and ministers of finance here. This makes a lot of sense. What we need to do is embrace blockchain for our fiat currencies. And I don't know what the underlying platform, I'm sure Ripple has some views on that, but this would be a very, very powerful thing. So think if you're a central banker and you put some money into the money supply during a crisis, rather than just giving it to banks and hoping they do something with it, you could helicopter drop it onto the mobile devices of in the US, say the 50 million poorest people. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but you could do things like that. You change the inflation rate, you'd have an instant transparency into what's happening rather than waiting months. You could have a much lighter touch on regulation, where sunlight is the best disinfectant, rather than having heavy-handed regulation of the financial industry. So we could actually reinvent government, we could help solve this crisis of legitimacy, and we could fundamentally change the way our economies are managed. So that's kind of a big deal. I'm pretty excited about government. It's why I was just actually in DC last week giving presentations to a number of government agencies. And we held a big dinner, and we had 15 CIOs from all across the federal government. And the excitement in that room was palpable. This is 1994. And 15 of the dozens and dozens of CIOs in Washington get it. And they self-selected to come out to that. All right, so let me close with a frank discussion of some of the problems, because that's all pretty glowing, what I just talked about. I mean, to begin, when you have a new paradigm, you typically get a leadership crisis, because new paradigms cause dislocation, conflict, confusion. They're nearly always received badly. I remember 1994, I used to say, who here has heard of the World Wide Web? And 10% of the hands would go up, and at the end of the talk, people would be, I don't know about that. And I get a fair bit of that today, honestly, but although that's changing very, very rapidly. So how are we going to find the leadership to make this happen? Well, for starters, leaders of old paradigms do have difficulty embracing the new. Now, Bitcoin is a fraud. This is coming from, it's sort of over the years. I've been around, I've seen most of this. I didn't see Thomas Edison in 1989. But, this is coming from a company that's investing more in blockchain than pretty much any other financial services industry. And it's like, so you have a cryptocurrency that's outside of fiat currency. I mean, really, everybody just relax, take a Valium. I did an interview for a Chinese publication, and China was curbing cryptocurrency exchanges. And the head of the central bank, the Bank of China, said the reason was we need to protect our fiat currency. And I said, well, no, you don't. I mean, Bitcoin will never be 1% of transactions in China. The only way to protect your fiat currency is to make it a 21st century currency and build it on a blockchain. So this is the problem of leaders of old paradigms. So that exists everywhere. And within an organization, do you know where leadership comes from? We've now studied hundreds, probably thousands at this point of organizations. And it's a big surprise. It can come from the CEO, but typically it comes from somewhere else. A CIO, a CTO, an outside partner. We documented a story where a secretary was the key person in the transformation of a division of a big bank. And she had what it took to be a leader. She just willed it. Because leadership is, the great visionary sells a vision down. That's not the model anymore. Because the person at the top can't learn for the organization as a whole anymore. Things are becoming too complicated. This is too big a change. So that's why leadership can come from anywhere, and I think it means it's each of our personal opportunity if we will it. So another problem is inappropriate government regulation. Do you know about the red flag laws in England? It's about in the early 20th century. The government, in its wisdom, concerned about these horseless carriages, passed a law that meant if you're going to be in an automobile, you need to have a driver, a navigator, and someone up front with a red flag so that the horses wouldn't get scared. And that actually impeded the development of the automobile industry in London. I remember back, I wish Tim was here, in the early days of the web, there was a proposal that anyone with a website should have to have a CB license. You know, just crazy. You know, I think there were like 800 of them in the world. So there are more than 800 websites today, so that would have been a problem. So it's this leaders of old paradigms have difficulty thinking about the new. So China banning ICOs, I think that's dumb. They should take a page from the SEC. And that's generally moving in the right direction. Now, there's part of what the regulators are doing in the US that I think are not sensible. For example, the idea of taxing increases the value of a currency as a capital gain. That seems dumb to me. Because, you know, if the value of the Canadian dollar goes up against the US dollar, I'm not going to be taxed as a Canadian for that. This is a currency. Leave it alone, and if it appreciates in value, let it appreciate in value. This is not a capital gain in any kind of sensible thinking of the term. So we're into an interesting period where regulators are going to be struggling to figure out what's the right thing to do. But I'll tell you, on ICOs, it'll be those regimes, those countries that get some sensible regulation that funds will flow to and that will have the greatest energy for an innovation economy. Now, I know there are lots of libertarians that say, what do you mean, there shouldn't be any regulation? I disagree with that. For the first era of the internet, it was about information. And my point of view was always, leave it alone. Just governments stay away. But now we're talking about things for which there's a public interest, like money and stocks and securities and votes and people's intellectual property and people's creative property, like music, and our identities. And we're going to need some sensible regulation that on the one hand ensures that consumers are protected, but on the other hand creates an environment where innovation can flourish. Now, which countries are doing this best? I've never really said this before, but I will today. Apparently we have 1 million people watching this on video right now. 100 billion people. These are some of the main candidates, I guess. We're here in Toronto. I would like to make a radical, a modest proposal to you that Canada is actually leading this. And this is not just my point of view. I was talking to a bunch of VCs from the Valley a couple of weeks ago, and they said that the innovation happening in this corridor between Waterloo and Toronto is now superior to what's going on in Silicon Valley. The first era of the internet was led by Silicon Valley. Leaders of old paradigms have great difficulty embracing the new. What do we got? Well, we got these 5 banks that are actually innovating. They're spending billions of dollars, and eventually they will create a new platform, if they do it right, a new platform for financial services. That's not going to happen in the US. 95 banks are never going to get together and do this. And one bank is not going to dominate and do it with its own special platform. Got great universities, Waterloo, great computer science. Ethereum, it's an important blockchain. It's invented by a Canadian. A new wave of blockchain entrepreneurs. Nuco. Where's Matt? Oh, and Paycase. Is he in the room? No. The biggest incubators in the world are in Toronto. There's always a big funding problem. Lousy venture capital, and the real problem was mid-stage. You get up to 20 million revenue, and you have to go to the Valley to raise your 30 million Series B. Well, now that problem's been obviated. There's a good regulatory environment. The regulators are working hard, great regulatory sandboxes. Government support. The government's putting $1 billion into matching funds around innovation. And this is stimulating a lot of activity. And in our Blockchain Research Institute, we have as members the Bank of Canada, the federal government, the Ontario government, and the City of Toronto, and the big health network in Toronto called the University Health Network. We used to have a brain drain, but now we have a brain gain. I don't know why that's happening, but a lot of people want to move to a place where it's a reasonable place to raise a family and when there's not too much craziness. And Canada's now the center in thought leadership through the Blockchain Research Institute. Okay, 2 more points. How do we steward this resource to go forward? And what's the state of the world on that? Well, the way that we think of governing global resources is by state-based institutions, right? They came out of Bretton Woods after the Second World War, and we created the IMF and the World Bank. And then a year later, the UN, a year later, the GATT and the WTO, and the G8 and the G20, global institutions based on nation states. Increasingly, though, since Bretton Woods, there are new models of governing global resources that involve the private sector, along with governments, the civil society, and individuals. And we, a couple of years ago, finished a $4 million research project on this that identified these various types of networks that are multi-stakeholder. They have all these different groups. They're not controlled by governments or states. They're self-organizing. And they're a bottom-up self-organizing phenomenon. By that definition, there are tens of millions of people right now at 1:30 in the afternoon that are involved in this activity. So the first era of the internet, and if Tim were here, he'd agree, is governed by these multi-stakeholder networks. You have the standards networks like the W3C Consortium or the Internet Engineering Task Force. Knowledge networks like the Internet Society. Delivery networks like ICANN. They just do stuff. They deliver domain names. Policy networks like the Internet Governance Forum. Advocacy networks like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Watchdog networks that are scrutinizing what's going on in the Internet, corruption, and so on. Network institutions like the World Economic Forum that are very complicated, but they're involved in governance. When it comes to blockchain, we're very early in the development of these robust type networks. And it's also more complicated. Now I don't have time to do this, so I'm just gonna tell you, if you Google my name and the World Economic Forum and the word blockchain, you'll come up with a report that we wrote for the WEF about how to move forward with the stewardship of blockchain. And the internet is a network of similar networks, whereas with blockchain, you got all these different platforms. You also have something that we call application ecosystems. That Belt and Road project, or the ecosystems that Ripple is building, involve all kinds of companies, governments are involved, regulators, civil society organizations, and they need to steward the resource at the application level. And then you have the big picture stuff. How do we ensure that the world is informed, that there are good use cases made public, that there's not bad regulation, and so on. So for each of these complicated stuff, and these are the challenges at the platform level. And so Ripple.net would be an example of one of these ecosystems that's attempting to govern and steward this resource at the platform level. You have application ecosystems, and then you have the overall blockchain ecosystem where you need to deal with these big issues. So to move forward with that, I'd encourage all of you to think not about how do we build just our business, but how do we participate more broadly in this ecosystem. This does not mean government. It does not mean top-down. It's the opposite of that. And as Pindar Wong, who's the chief architect in the Belt and Road Project, one of our collaborators, says, just because it's distributed doesn't mean it needs to be disorganized. So let's find new ways of cooperating together. That report gives a taxonomy and a framework on how to do that. Now the final one is how do we achieve strategic insight? Everyone's doing pilots and so on. We need insight about how this technology transforms industries, how it changes the way you manage a company. What does blockchain mean for the chief information officer, for example? I can't find anyone who can talk to me for more than 5 minutes about what this means for IT architecture for an enterprise, because a company's not a bunch of pilots and business units, it's an enterprise. We need enterprise strategy, enterprise standards, enterprise infrastructure, and we're in the early days of figuring that out. So I just wanted to tell you that we're doing the definitive, I guess, investigation of all this multi-million-dollar program, and we're doing 70 projects right now. There they are. Has everyone absorbed that? Okay, good. Moving right along. And each of these projects is led by some world's leading thinker. I'm very proud. I mean, I work on smart contracts being led by Nick Szabo. And in the video introduction to his report, which we released to our members last week, I said, I think this is the most important document ever written about smart contracts, with the exception of his 1996 document that defined the concept. So every week we have new companies joining, and ta-da, I would like to announce today that CIBC and TD are the first Canadian banks to join this project, and also Microsoft Canada. So we wanted to highlight some Canadian organizations that are participating. If you're from CIBC and TD, thank you very much. Those of you from banks who are from other banks, call. Have your people call my people. No, we need to talk. All the banks will join, and we're very thankful. So this is a somewhat out-of-date list of these companies, but we've got many of the world's leading companies. It costs a couple $100,000 to join the program, but for that you get millions of dollars worth of IP. So, to close, the state of the blockchain world is good. The arc is a positive one. It's moving at an unprecedented rate, and it's accelerating. I said this is 1994, but there's a big difference. In 1994, with the Internet of Information, most people didn't use a computer. There was no mobile web because there was no mobility. You young people wouldn't remember, but telephones used to have a wire coming out the end of them, and they plugged into a wall or into your car. Today, we've got 6.5 billion people with a supercomputer in their pocket. Do you remember in 1994, it would take 2 minutes for a web page to load because it was called dial-up. Today, we have broadband in most places in the world. There was no real industry in 1994. There were no informed users in 1994. We have all of those preconditions today. My view is that this will accelerate, and it's going to happen very, very fast. So buckle up, everybody. What will the future bring? Well, final thought on that is I'm a big believer of the theory that the future is not something to be predicted. The future is something to be achieved. And we have an opportunity here to reinvent the banking system for high performance and all kinds of new value for citizens, to include a couple of billion more people in the world, and to make an industry that's sustainable. We have an opportunity to change the corporation, to create a new kind of networked enterprise that can create new value. And we have an opportunity to solve many of our biggest problems. Today I've mentioned stuff like climate change. I mean, the killer app for blockchain may end up being saving the planet, literally. But we've also got opportunities to solve big problems like the crisis of legitimacy of government and other issues. So this is a time of great, great opportunity. And if we do this right, we work hard, then maybe this new age of distributed trust will be an age where the promise is fulfilled. If I may close with an analogy. Now, you're going to see it better on this screen, I think, because that one's kind of washed out. Alex and I have been studying nature recently to understand what distributed trust looks like. Fish come in schools, bees come in swarms. Starlings over the moors of England come in something called a murmuration. Murmuration. Anyone heard that term? It refers to the murmuring of the wings of the birds. And starlings are out over a 20-mile radius throughout the day doing their starling thing. And at night they come together and create one of the most spectacular things in all of nature. Now, the murmuration is not just for show. It has functions. It warms the birds up for the cold night, and it protects the birds. On the right of the screen here, you can see a hawk, 25 times the size of a starling, a predator of starlings being chased away by the collective power of the little birds. Scientists that have studied this say they've never seen an accident. There's leadership, but there's no one leader. Now, is this some kind of fanciful analogy about the state of the blockchain world? Well, actually, this thing functions according to the 7 principles of blockchain that we define in the book. It's a massive collaboration. Remember I said trust is achieved not by an intermediary, but by collaboration, cryptography, and clever code. There is code in the DNA of the birds that gives them some rules. You know, the big one is don't bump into anybody else. But also don't get too far away. There's a great sharing of information. It's a peer-to-peer thing. There's no intermediary or no central authority running this whole thing. And it has a great interdependence. You know, when I'm talking to CEOs, I say, you know what? Business can't succeed in a world that's failing. And we have to step up to some of these big problems that exist today. This thing functions as if the interest of the individual bird is connected to the interest of the murmuration as a whole. And it has a great integrity, which you heard me say is the foundation of trust. Trust is the expectation that the other party does the right thing. And a tiny little bird chase a killer of 25 times its size because it knows that the other birds, it's back. Now, this is a stimulus response thing. There's no cognition. But imagine if we could layer cognition in on this. Could we connect our network that built a new financial system and beyond, a network made of glass and air? Could we create some kind of new distributed world that would be a better one? Well, I'm so excited about this. I think that in the natural forms, you can see trust is endemic to the platform, areas or other institutions, and what a powerful thing. Who knows? Maybe if we do this right, this new distributed world will be a better one. So thank you very much.
Don, thank you very much. Really, really appreciate it. I don't know if we have time for Q&A today, unfortunately, but again, what a great way to end 3 days at Swell with such deep strategic insights from one of the real thought leaders around the blockchain. Obviously, a broad perspective on what's going to happen, and actually very inspirational. So again, one more quick hand for Don Tapscott. Thank you, Don. So we are just about to wrap up Swell. We're minutes away. Before we do, we have a quick video. We wanted to share some of the highlights over the last couple of days, and afterwards I'll come up with some concluding thoughts.
It's okay. Thank you.